My mother's French-tipped acrylic nail dug into my bicep, a sharp, surgical pinch that yanked me backward behind a towering, fake floral arrangement. "Stay out of sight, Laura. You're too big. You're ruining your sister's wedding photos," she hissed through grit teeth, her smile never wavering for the photographer. I am Laura, 32 years old, a captain in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I've spent my life in the mud, managing defense projects worth millions of dollars. But in this New Jersey banquet hall, I'm just a broken pawn my own mother hides in the shadows. She took the microphone, looked me dead in the eye before 120 guests, and declared, "Some children are born to shine, others are born to be the audience." The crowd roared with applause. My mother took a triumphant sip of champagne. She has no idea that under the table, my hand is gripping a blue envelope. An envelope containing the truth about the death sentence she handed my life 14 years ago. Before I expose the monster hiding behind the mask of a loving mother, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had your own family trample on your self-worth. The air in the bridal suite was thick with the suffocating scent of hairspray and my mother's Chanel No. 5. It was a smell that usually signaled a social victory for Diane Jordan, but for me, it was the smell of an oncoming migraine. I stood behind my sister Brooke, performing my assigned duty, zipping up a $3,000 Vera Wang gown that cost more than my first used truck. My fingers, calloused from years of handling rifles and heavy construction equipment at Fort Liberty, felt clumsy against the delicate silk. Diane marched into the room, her Ralph Lauren heels clicking like a firing squad on the hardwood floor. She didn't offer a smile. Instead, she swiped my hands away as if I were a stray dog bothering a thoroughbred. "Move, Laura," she hissed, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft jazz playing in the background. She gripped my forearm, her French-tipped acrylics digging deep into my skin, and shoved me toward the corner. "You're sweating. You'll stain the silk, and for God's sake, stay behind that curtain. You're too dark from the sun, and your shoulders are too broad. You'll dim the frame for Brooke's solo shots." I stood where I was told. A 32-year-old captain in the United States Army Corps of Engineers, reduced to a household eyesore because my skin carried the tan of the North Carolina sun and my body carried the muscle of a soldier. I watched Brooke giggle as the photographer adjusted her veil. She wasn't evil, not inherently, but she had been molded by Diane into a golden idol, a PR specialist who lived for the lens, while I was the scapegoat buried in the dirt. By the time the reception started at the Cherry Hill Country Club, the physical discomfort had become a dull roar. Diane had intentionally ordered my bridesmaid dress 2 sizes too small. She claimed it was a motivation for me to lose the military bulk, but we both knew the truth. She wanted me to look squeezed, uncomfortable, and awkward. The scratchy, cheap tulle was a sickly shade of swamp green that made my olive complexion look ashen. Every time I breathed, the fabric dug into my ribs, a constant reminder that there was no room for me in this family. I sat at the very last table, the one tucked behind a massive floral arrangement near the service entrance. My companions were 2 distant cousins I hadn't seen in a decade and a group of screaming toddlers. Across the room, at the head table, Diane was a queen in her element. She moved from guest to guest, her laughter tinkling like the silver forks hitting the fine crystal. Every time someone asked about me, I watched her mouth move, her eyes casting a brief, disparaging glance toward my dark corner before she turned back to her captive audience with a sigh of staged disappointment. "Another martini, Patricia?" Diane's voice carried across the room as she leaned over my aunt. Aunt Patricia didn't look up. She clutched her glass, her knuckles white. She had seen Diane shove me earlier. She had seen the way I was being erased. But Patricia just nodded, her eyes darting away from mine, calling for the waiter to bring more gin. The silence of the crowd was a different kind of weapon, one that didn't leave bruises but left you wondering if you actually existed. Then came the speeches. The room went quiet as the overhead lights dimmed, leaving only the spotlight on the mahogany podium. Diane stood there, the microphone humming to life. She spent 10 minutes detailing Brooke's rise in the PR world, calling her the jewel of the Jordan legacy. Then she turned her gaze toward the shadows where I sat. Her lip curled into a practiced, pitying smirk. "And then there's Laura," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Our little soldier. She does, well, whatever it is they do in the army. Support work, I suppose. It's hard work, no doubt, and it's perfect for someone with her limited reach. I always tell her, Brooke was born to lead the parade, and Laura was born to watch it from the sidewalk. Some children are born to shine. Others, like my Laura, were only born to be an audience." The room erupted in polite, wealthy laughter. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I didn't move. I stayed in a perfect position of attention, my jaw locked tight enough to crack a tooth. I didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry when the enemy is ranging their position. They wait. They observe. They look for the opening. Under the table, my hand slipped into my black satin clutch. I didn't feel the fabric. I felt the sharp, rigid edge of the blue envelope I had hidden there. It was heavy, high-bond paper, embossed with the seal of Columbia University. 14 years. For 14 years, I believed I wasn't smart enough, that I was just a grunt who couldn't cut it in the Ivy League. I believed I had failed because that was the script Diane wrote for me. My index finger traced the top edge of the envelope. I pressed down, hard. The paper was razor-sharp, slicing through the skin of my fingertip with surgical precision. The sting was grounding. I looked down and saw a single dark bead of blood welling up, staining the white linen napkin in my lap. The sound of the wedding, the clinking glasses, the fake laughter, the nauseating scent of Chanel, began to fade into a hollow echo. The bright lights of the New Jersey ballroom blurred into a gray mist. Suddenly, I wasn't 32 anymore. I was 18. I could hear the rhythmic drum of heavy rain hitting a tin mailbox. I could feel the cold, wet metal against my palm as I reached for a letter that would never arrive. Because 14 years ago, a monster had stolen my future before I even knew I had one. The trap was set, and Diane Jordan had no idea she was the one walking into the kill zone. The bead of blood on my finger isn't just a paper cut. It's a portal. As the expensive ballroom in New Jersey begins to blur, the smell of burnt grease and industrial-strength bleach rushes back to meet me. I'm no longer a 32-year-old captain. I'm 18 again, standing in the back of Sal's Pizza on a Tuesday night, scrubbing the grout of a bathroom floor that never seems to get clean. In 2012, my life was measured in single-dollar bills. Every night, after the football crowd cleared out and the grease trap started to moan, I'd count my wages. I remember the sensation of those bills, slimy, saturated with the smell of pepperoni and floor wax. I'd spend 20 minutes every night at the kitchen table, smoothing them out, trying to wipe away the oil so the bank wouldn't reject them. I needed $63. That was the magic number. The application fee for Columbia University. To my mother, Diane, $63 was the price of a fancy lunch. To me, it was 63 hours of breathing in flour dust and scrubbing toilets. I kept that money in a chipped coffee mug hidden behind the canned peas in the pantry. One afternoon, I went to count it, and half was gone. I found Brooke in the living room, spinning in a new silk sunburst dress. Diane just sipped her tea and said, "I used a little of your pizza money for Brooke's debate club outfit." Image is everything, Laura. You're working anyway, you'll make more. Besides, Brooke needs to look the part of a winner. I didn't argue. I just went back to Sal's and worked double shifts. I used Gorilla Glue to hold the soles of my sneakers together because I couldn't afford a new pair and the application fee at the same time. Every step I took in those shoes made a sticky, rhythmic clicking sound, a reminder of exactly what I was sacrificing for a chance to leave. The day I finally mailed that envelope was a gray, miserable afternoon in April. I didn't take the bus. I ran 3 miles in the pouring rain to the post office on Highway 9. I didn't want that blue envelope sitting in our home mailbox where Diane could see it. I remember the cold, wet iron of the mail slot as I pushed the packet through. I whispered a prayer to a God I hadn't spoken to in years, asking for a way out. Then came the waiting. For 3 weeks, I was a ghost in my own house. I would get off the school bus and sprint down the driveway, heart hammering against my ribs, just to check the mail. Every day, the box was empty. Or rather, it contained junk mail and Vogue magazines for Brooke. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out for 14 long years, was that the trap had already been set. On a Tuesday, the 28th of April, Diane's shift at the real estate office ended 25 minutes early. She was standing behind the sheer curtains of the living room, watching. She saw the mail truck pull away. She walked to the box, pulled out a thick, heavy envelope with a bright blue Columbia logo, and walked back inside. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She just walked to the kitchen and shoved it under the rotting bags of old leftovers in the trash bin. I walked into the house 10 minutes later, soaked to the bone and breathless. Diane was in the kitchen, casually stirring a cup of Earl Grey tea. The steam rose in a delicate swirl, masking the coldness in her eyes. "Any mail, Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling with a hope that made me feel sick. She didn't even look up from her tea. She just let out a long theatrical sigh that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "Nothing, Laura. I checked it myself. I'm sorry, honey. But honestly, it's probably for the best." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "What do you mean?" "Your actual abilities, Laura," she said, finally meeting my eyes with a look of terrifying pity. "You've always been a worker, a drudge. Columbia is for people like Brooke. People with spark. If they didn't write back, it's because they saw what I've always seen. You'd only fail there, and the shame would break you. This way, you can move on to something more suited to your station." I fell to my knees. I literally fell to my knees on the living room carpet. The weight of every floor I'd scrubbed, every greasy dollar I'd saved, and every dream I dared to have came crashing down on my chest. I felt like I was drowning in the middle of a dry room. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the hardwood floor of my bedroom, ear pressed to the wood, listening. At 2 a.m, the silence of the house was broken by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the printer in Diane's home office. Re, the sound of a machine churning out a new destiny for me. The next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, a stack of glossy brochures was sitting on top of my bowl of cereal. They weren't for universities. They were for local vocational schools and technical colleges for hands-on learners. Diane was smiling, a sharp, terrifyingly bright smile. "I did some research. These are much more your speed, Laura. No need to aim for the clouds when you're built for the dirt." The humiliation was a physical fire in my throat. I couldn't stay. I couldn't look at Brooke's designer clothes or Diane's Earl Grey tea for one more second. I walked out the front door, leaving my breakfast untouched. I didn't go to school. I walked 2 hours until I reached the strip mall near the interstate. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the United States Army Recruiting Center. The air inside smelled like stale coffee and floor wax, the smell of a world that didn't care about spark or image. I walked up to the sergeant at the desk, my eyes burning but my voice steady. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from the woman who had just told me I was born for the dirt. I picked up the pen and signed my life away for the next 4 years. I thought I was escaping. I had no idea I was just completing the sentence she had written for me. Can you feel that? That hollow, sick feeling in your stomach when you realize the person who was supposed to protect you was the one holding the knife? If you've ever been the scapegoat while someone else got the golden treatment, I need you to hit that like button right now. Let's show the world how many of us survived these houses of glass. And do me a favor, comment the word truth if you think a mother's jealousy is the most dangerous thing in the world. I'm reading every single one of your stories. Don't go anywhere, because the captain is about to find out exactly how deep this betrayal goes. The red clay of North Carolina has a way of staining everything it touches. It gets under your fingernails, into the seams of your boots, and settles deep into the pores of your skin. For 14 years, that dust was my reality. While my sister Brooke was navigating the air-conditioned hallways of Manhattan PR firms, I was crawling through barbed wire at Fort Liberty, breathing in diesel fumes and grit. I wasn't just a soldier, I was a builder. I took the GSI bill and turned it into an engineering degree, grinding through night classes while my peers were out at bars. I climbed the ranks until I was Captain Laura Jordan, commanding 30 men on a $4 million construction site. I stood in the middle of a massive excavation project, barking orders over the roar of excavators, directing the flow of concrete and steel. Out there, under the blistering sun, I was a leader. My word was law. My expertise was unquestioned. I had built barracks that housed hundreds and bridges that held the weight of tanks. Yet, every time my phone vibrated with a text from New Jersey, I felt that stature shrink. I was a decorated officer, a woman who managed multi-million-dollar government assets. But in the quiet moments inside my tent, I was still the girl who wasn't good enough for the Ivy League. This was the psychological war Diane Jordan had been winning for over a decade. It's called imposter syndrome. But for me, it was a specialized form of psychological operations. A constant, low-frequency hum of doubt that my mother had tuned to the exact frequency of my soul. I could lead men into a crisis, but I couldn't walk into my mother's kitchen without feeling like a failure. The night before my promotion ceremony to captain, I sat on the edge of my cot, my fingers still stained with the dust of the day's work. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from the weight of my body armor, but I felt a rare spark of pride. My commanding officer had recommended me for a special commendation for completing a high-stakes defense project ahead of schedule. More than that, I had finally saved enough for a down payment. I was 31 years old and I was buying my first home, a small, sturdy place with a porch where I could finally breathe. I hit the call button for Diane. I was seeking that tiny, elusive sliver of maternal pride, the one I had been chasing since I was 6 years old. "Mom," I said, my voice sounding younger, thinner than it did on the job site. "I have some news. I'm being promoted to captain tomorrow. And I'm buying a house. It's a 3-bedroom near the base." On the other end of the line, I didn't hear a cheer. I heard the rhythmic, wet crunch of a salad. Diane was eating. "That's nice, Laura," she said, her tone as flat as a New Jersey turnpike. "But honestly, building things in the dirt, it sounds so industrial, so filthy." I saw a segment on the news about how those military towns are just full of crime and dust. Is that really where you want to put down roots? It seems so permanent for someone with your lack of social standing. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Mom, it's a huge achievement. I worked for years to save this money." My commander said. "Oh, please," she interrupted, her voice sharpening. Today was the big day for Brooke. She's on the cover of the company's internal newsletter. A full-page spread, Laura. She looks like a literal angel. She's the real model of success in this family. She just moved into a stunning apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. It's sophisticated. It's where people actually live, not some dusty outpost. She didn't ask about the promotion ceremony. She didn't ask for the address of my new home. She just went back to her salad. "I have to go. The laundry is done. Try to stay hydrated, dear. You know how the sun makes your skin look like old leather." The line went dead. The hollow, lifeless dial tone echoed in my ear like a funeral bell. I sat there in the dark, my arm dropping to my side, the phone feeling like a lead weight. I had just built a $4 million facility, and my mother had made me feel like I was still scrubbing the floors at Sal's Pizza. Fast forward 6 months. It was 2 in the morning, and the wedding was only weeks away. I was sitting in my SUV in the parking lot of a Wawa gas station, the only place open for miles. I was halfway through a cold, soggy turkey sandwich, the fluorescent lights of the station reflecting off my tired face in the rearview mirror. My life was a cycle of duty and dismissal. I was a captain by day and a disappointment by night. I was scrolling through a military forum, looking for advice on veteran transition benefits, when a banner caught my eye. The blue light of the screen hit my face, illuminating the exhaustion etched into my features. Columbia University, School of General Studies, priority admissions for active duty officers. I stopped chewing. I stared at those 2 words. Columbia University. The name that had been used as a whip to lash my self-esteem for 14 years. The place I was told I was too limited to ever attend. My hand trembled as I clicked the link. My heart started to race, a different kind of adrenaline than the one I felt on the construction site. I looked around the empty parking lot. The world was quiet, but inside my chest, a fire was starting to roar. I wasn't that 18-year-old girl anymore. I was a captain in the United States Army. I had managed 30 men and $4 million. If I could build a barracks from nothing but dirt and blueprints, I could build a life that Diane couldn't touch. I reached over and hit the lock button on the SUV. The sharp clack of the doors engaging echoed in the cabin. I was shutting out the world. I was shutting out Diane's voice. For the first time in my life, I wasn't following a command. I was initiating a maneuver. I gripped the steering wheel, my calloused fingers tightening until the leather creaked. I wasn't born to be an audience. I was born to take command. And the first thing I was going to do was take back the 14 years she stole from me. 3 o'clock in the morning at the Bachelor Officer Quarters at Fort Liberty has a specific kind of silence. It is not the peaceful silence of a suburban home. It is the heavy hum-filled quiet of a military installation waiting for the sun to explode over the horizon. The fluorescent light in my small room flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz, cast in a harsh, clinical glow over my laptop screen. My eyes felt like they were full of North Carolina red clay, but I couldn't stop. I had spent 14 years following someone else's script. A script that said I was a drudge, a follower, someone destined to watch from the sidewalk. Tonight, the only orders I was following were my own. I began to type. I didn't use flowery language or academic jargon. I didn't have time for metaphors. I wrote about the weight of a landmine in the palm of your hand when the humidity is 90%, and your heartbeat is the only thing you can hear. I wrote about the logistics of managing 30 lives, 30 families, and $4 million worth of steel and concrete, while the world outside looked at my uniform and saw only a rank, not a woman. 14 years of suppressed rage, of being told my skin was too dark and my shoulders were too broad for a New Jersey ballroom, flowed through my bruised, calloused fingertips and onto the digital page. This wasn't just a college essay. It was a mission report on the survival of my own soul. By the time the sun began to bleed through the blinds, I had finished. I didn't feel tired. I felt like I was clearing a path through a minefield. I looked at the dregs of cold, black coffee at the bottom of my paper cup. Bitter, acidic, and honest. This was my life. Not the Earl Grey tea in a china cup, but the grit of a mission accomplished before the rest of the world woke up. At 8 o'clock sharp, I stood outside the office of Colonel Harris. He was an old-school engineer with a scar running across his forehead like a map of forgotten battles and a gaze that could peel paint off a Humvee. He was the closest thing to a father figure I'd ever known, mostly because he judged me by the quality of my blueprints rather than the size of my dress. I handed him the printed request for a letter of recommendation. He slid his glasses down his nose and scanned the document. The room was silent except for the faint whir of a desk fan. Then he picked up a heavy fountain pen and signed his name with a decisive, jagged flourish. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't tell me to be realistic. He pushed the paper back toward me and nodded, his voice like gravel. "Captain Jordan," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "Columbia is the one that needs to prove they are worthy of an officer like you. Don't let those Ivy League ivory towers make you think otherwise." He stood up, walked around the desk, and placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. It was a rough, paternal gesture that carried more warmth than any hug Diane had given me in 3 decades. "Your parents must be incredibly proud to have a daughter like this." I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper to keep from breaking. I wanted to tell him that my mother didn't even have his phone number in her contacts for emergencies. I wanted to tell him that she thought my job was industrial filth. Instead, I just stood at a perfect position of attention, saluted, and walked out before the tears could betray the uniform. 2 weeks before I was scheduled to fly back to the territory for Brooke's wedding, a white United States Postal Service truck pulled up to the barracks. The mail clerk handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It wasn't a bill or a military circular. It was high-bond paper. And the return address featured a blue shield I recognized from my darkest dreams. I walked to my Jeep, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly tore the paper. I pulled out the letter. "We are pleased to inform you." The words blurred. I put my head against the steering wheel and let out a sound that wasn't a sob. It It was the sound of a 14-year-old cage door finally swinging open. I sat there for 20 minutes, my shoulders shaking, while the North Carolina heat turned the interior of the Jeep into a furnace. I wasn't the audience anymore. I was a student of the elite. I was the proof that Diane Jordan was a liar. But I didn't call New Jersey. The 18-year-old Laura would have picked up the phone, desperate for a congratulations that would never come. The 32-year-old captain established total radio silence. This was a classified operation now. I folded the letter with military precision and tucked it into a secret, zippered compartment inside my black satin clutch. The one Diane had told me was too sophisticated for someone like me. I packed my bags. I didn't just pack the swamp green bridesmaid dress. I packed my formal army dress blues, the gold buttons polished until they shone like tactical mirrors. As I sat on the plane, watching the clouds shift over the Atlantic coast, I felt a cold, calculated calm settle over me. I wasn't just going to a wedding. I was going back to the site of the crime. I was carrying a shield made of high-bond blue paper, and I was heading straight into the kill zone of Diane's ego. She wanted me to be a spectator in the back row. She had no idea that her invisible daughter was about to become the most dangerous person in the room. The reception hall of the Cherry Hill Country Club was a masterclass in suburban pretension. The air was thick with the scent of over-fertilized lilies and the sharp, acidic tang of cheap champagne being served to the guests at the secondary tables. To the outside observer, it was a celebration of Brooke's new life. To me, it was a high-stakes psychological battlefield where the minds weren't buried in the dirt of a construction site, but hidden behind porcelain smiles and crystal flutes. I walked through the double mahogany doors, my black satin clutch held tight against my side. I could feel the rigid, unyielding edge of the blue Columbia envelope through the fabric. It was my only armor, a secret weapon locked in a silent chamber. "Laura, dear, there you are." Diane's voice sliced through the ambient jazz before I even saw her. The rhythmic, aggressive click-clack of her stiletto heels on the polished hardwood floor sounded like a tactical countdown. She approached me with a predatory grace, her eyes performing a swift, cold inventory of my appearance. They lingered with obvious distaste on the swamp green tulle dress that Diane had insisted was my size, despite the way it constricted my lungs and bit into my shoulders. She reached out, her fingers, capped with those razor-sharp, French-tipped acrylics, patting my arm with a touch that felt like a splash of ice water. "You look functional, very sturdy." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed the back of my chair. It wasn't an invitation to sit, it was a forced relocation. She began dragging the chair across the floor toward the far darkened corner of the ballroom, right next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen and the noisy corridor leading to the restrooms. "I took the liberty of moving your place card," she whispered, her voice dropping into that fake, honeyed tone she reserved for her most effective manipulations. "I know you aren't used to communicating with the sophisticated types at the head table. You've spent so much time in those dusty tents with the enlisted men. I thought you'd be far more comfortable back here with the children and some of the distant cousins. It's less pressure for you, my little sentinel. Just stay here and enjoy the view of your sister's moment. Try not to let your military posture intimidate the other guests." I sat down. The chair was uneven, wobbling on the transition between the carpet and the hardwood. The smell from the kitchen, fried appetizers, and industrial-strength dish soap was nauseatingly present. At the center of the room, the golden table, was a sea of laughter and warm, golden light. Brooke sat there, glowing in her expensive white silk, while Diane stood nearby like a queen presiding over her own vanity. As the first course was served, a bland, lukewarm salmon, Diane began her rounds. She moved from table to table with a glass of Pinot Grigio in one hand, her movements calculated to draw every eye in the room. She made sure her voice carried. That was her specialty, the public broadcast of her own perceived martyrdom. "It's been such an exhausting journey," I heard her say to a group of wealthy neighbors 3 tables away. Brooke's new apartment in the city. The down payment was absolutely astronomical. But what is a mother for, if not to sacrifice every last cent for her child's brilliance? We've invested everything into her career, her image. She is the crown jewel of this family, a true testament to what focus can achieve. A distant uncle, a man named Bill whom I hadn't seen since my deployment, leaned over and asked a quiet question. He pointed a fork toward my dark corner. Diane didn't even turn around. She just let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that cut through the music like a knife. "Oh, Laura?" She tossed her head back, her pearls clinking. Laura is a different breed entirely. She doesn't have those kinds of ambitions. She's perfectly content with her bunk bed in the barracks. She's a drudge, really. Dry, industrial, and quite happy to stay in the dirt where things are simple. She doesn't need the views or the city lights. She just needs a set of orders and a shovel. It's a pity, but some people are just built for the background. She's always been our little spectator. I swallowed a bite of the salmon. It tasted like ash. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a rapid-fire drumbeat I could feel in my teeth. I looked down at my hands, resting them on the cheap linen of the side table. My knuckles were white. I had managed $4 million of government property. I had kept 30 men alive and focused in high-stress environments, and here I was, being described as a mindless, unambitious tool by the woman who gave me life. At the center table, the atmosphere shifted. Aunt Patricia sat there, her hand trembling as she clutched a bone-dry martini. She had been watching me all night, her eyes flickering between me and Diane with a growing, frantic intensity. Every time Diane took a public shot at my dignity, Patricia's face grew tighter, her jaw locking. Beside her, Grandma Martha sat like a stone statue. Martha was 82 years old, an Irish-American woman who believed in the weight of a person's word and the sanctity of the truth. She didn't like the noise Diane was making. "That's enough, Diane." Martha's voice wasn't loud, but it had the authority of a military command. She slammed her fork down onto her porcelain plate with a crack that silenced the immediate area. "You've said quite enough for one evening. Sit down and eat your dinner before you make a fool of yourself." The silence lasted for maybe 5 seconds. Diane just blinked, her smile twitching but refusing to fade. In her narcissistic world, a warning was merely a challenge to be overcome. She turned back to the room, her eyes locking onto mine across the sea of tables. She began walking toward me, her heels hitting the floor with increasing intensity. She stopped right behind me, leaning down so the suffocating smell of her Chanel No. 5 filled my senses. She placed a heavy, controlling hand on my shoulder and squeezed, her nails digging into the cheap tool. "Don't mind Grandma," she said, her voice projected loudly for the benefit of the surrounding tables. "She's just tired. But look at your sister, Laura. See how happy she is? That's what a real life looks like. Once this wedding is over, you should really think about finding a normal job. Maybe a receptionist at a construction firm. Something where you don't have to get your hands so filthy. Who knows, if you try hard enough, you might even get to see a tiny corner of the life Brooke has built for herself." The gaslighting was so thick I could barely draw a breath. She was standing there, pretending to offer motherly advice while she publicly dismantled my entire career and identity. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to believe that my 14 years of service were nothing more than a failed experiment. I felt the rage, but it wasn't the hot, messy kind. It was cold. It was tactical. It was the feeling of a weapon being loaded in a darkened room. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. Aunt Patricia stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floorboards, a high-pitched, agonizing sound that made every guest in the ballroom wince. She knocked over her martini glass, the clear liquid spilling across the white linen like a spreading stain. She wasn't looking at the spill. She was staring at Diane with eyes that were wide, bloodshot, and filled with 14 years of suppressed, agonizing secrets. The air in the room vanished. The music seemed to stop. Every head turned toward table 1. Patricia's chest was heaving, her hand pointing a shaking finger at my mother. The fuse was finally lit. The high-pitched screech of Aunt Patricia's chair against the polished floorboards was the first shot in a war that had been brewing for 14 years. It was a sound so sharp, so jarring, that it seemed to slice through the smooth, rhythmic wail of the saxophone solo playing in the background. The ballroom, which only a second ago had been filled with the clinking of silver and the low hum of self-important conversation, suddenly fell into a hollow, airless silence. Patricia stood there, swaying slightly, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. Her bone-dry martini glass lay on its side, the clear liquid soaking into the expensive white linen like a spreading, invisible wound. She wasn't looking at the mess. Her bloodshot eyes were locked onto my mother with a raw, agonizing intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Sit down, Patricia," Diane said, her voice remaining as smooth as the silk of her dress. She didn't even look up from her plate. She just reached out with her French-tipped nails to adjust a stray lily in the centerpiece. "You've clearly had one too many. You're making a scene at your niece's wedding." "A scene?" Patricia's voice was hoarse, but every word was a jagged stone thrown into the silence. She stepped away from the table, stumbling slightly toward where I sat in my darkened corner. She ignored the gasps of the guests at the surrounding tables. She ignored Grandma Martha's stern warning. She stopped right in front of me, her shadow falling over my swamp green dress. "Do you know, Laura? Do you finally know what she did to you?" I froze. My heart began to drum against my ribs. Thump, thump, thump. A heavy mechanical beat that felt like it was trying to burst through my chest. The air in the room grew cold, despite the hundreds of bodies pressed into the space. "What are you talking about, Aunt Pat?" I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Patricia turned, her shaking finger pointing directly at my mother's throat. "The letter, Laura. The blue envelope from Columbia University. You think you failed? You think you weren't good enough? You were accepted, you poor girl. You were accepted with a full academic scholarship 14 years ago." The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. I saw a guest at the next table stop mid-chew, a forkful of roast beef suspended in the air. I saw a photographer's flash go off in the distance, a sudden blinding burst of violet light that left purple spots dancing on my retinas. "She took it," Patricia hissed, her eyes filling with tears of long-buried guilt. "I saw her, Laura. April of 2012. I came over for coffee and saw that blue shield through the window of the mailbox. I watched her pull it out. She didn't even open it. She just looked at your name, walked straight to the kitchen, and shoved it to the bottom of the trash bin under the rotting scraps of Sunday's dinner. She told me if I ever said a word, she'd make sure I never saw this family again. She stole your life, Laura. She threw your future in the garbage because she couldn't stand the thought of you being more than her." I felt a drop of cold sweat slide down my spine, tracing the line of my vertebrae like an icy needle. The smell of the room, the cloying Chanel No. 5, the stale appetizers, the expensive wine, suddenly became a suffocating fog. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't have the strength for it. I just slowly, painfully, turned my head to look at the woman sitting at the head table. I was searching for a human reaction. I was waiting for her to gasp, to stutter, to offer a frantic denial, or even to show a flicker of shame in those cold, blue eyes. I wanted just 1% of a mother to be left in there. I wanted her to prove Patricia wrong, to tell me it was all a drunken lie. My hands were shaking so violently I had to tuck them under my thighs to hide the tremors. Diane Jordan didn't blink. She didn't even stop the rhythmic stirring of her wine. She picked up her glass, the vintage Pinot Grigio catching the light of the chandeliers, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She looked at me over the rim of the crystal, her eyes as hard as diamonds and just as hollow. Then she leaned back, a tiny, jagged smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph, the look of a predator who had finally tired of the game. "Don't look at me like that, Laura," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. She didn't lower her tone. She didn't care who heard. The gaslighting was over, the mask had finally shattered, and what lay beneath was a monster made of ice. So what if I did? You were a naive, clumsy girl. You wouldn't have lasted a single semester at an Ivy League school. I was protecting the Jordan name from the embarrassment of your inevitable failure. I did you a favor. I gave you the only life you were actually capable of living. The disgust that rose in my throat was a physical weight, thick and bitter. I looked at the woman who had proclaimed my death sentence 14 years ago and realized she wasn't just my mother. She was the architect of every failure I had ever felt. I felt the heat of the ballroom lights, the staring eyes of 100 guests, and the sudden, sharp clarity of a soldier on the brink of an ambush. My gaze dropped to my black satin purse. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I reached down, my fingers finding the cold, silver latch. Click. The sound of the purse opening was the loudest thing in the room. It was the sound of a safety being switched off. Diane was still smiling, still savoring the taste of her own cruelty. But she had no idea that I was no longer the audience. I was the commanding officer, and I had just found the target. I need you to take a breath with me. Can you feel the absolute freezing weight of that betrayal? Imagine working every night in a pizza shop, scrubbing floors until your hands bled, just for the person you loved most to throw your dreams into the trash. If your heart is breaking for Laura right now, please hit that like button. We need to show these survivors that we see them. And I want you to do one more thing. Comment the word "beyond" if you believe Laura is about to take her life back. I want to see a wall of support for her in the comments. Don't go anywhere. The captain just opened her purse, and what's inside is going to burn this whole house down. The silence that followed Aunt Patricia's outburst was not the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, ionized stillness that precedes a lightning strike. The ballroom of the Cherry Hill Country Club, once a cathedral of suburban vanity, had become a vacuum. At the head table, Diane Jordan's smile remained frozen, a brittle porcelain mask held together by sheer willpower and narcissism. Her fingers were still wrapped around the stem of her wine glass, her French-tipped nails appearing like white talons against the crystal. To anyone else, she looked like a mother in shock. To me, she looked like a cornered predator calculating her next move. For a heartbeat, the 18-year-old girl inside me wanted to scream. She wanted to overturn the table, to sob, to demand an apology for the 14 years of lies that had just been dragged into the light. But that girl was gone, buried under the red clay of North Carolina and the iron discipline of Fort Liberty. In her place stood a captain of the United States Army. I felt my pulse slow down, a cold, rhythmic thrumming in my ears. I didn't see a wedding guest or a mother. I saw a target. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, one so deep it strained the seams of the cheap, swamp-green tulle of my bridesmaid dress. I adjusted my posture, my spine straightening into a perfect military bearing, my chin lifting just enough to establish a line of sight that Diane couldn't escape. The room didn't feel like a party anymore. It was a kill zone, and I was the only one with a weapon. Diane's eyes darted toward the surrounding tables. She saw the guests whispering, the judgmental glares of her peers, and the way the photographer had lowered his camera in confusion. She realized her empire of image was crumbling. She did the only thing a narcissist knows how to do. She tried to weaponize my guilt. "Laura, look at what you're doing," she whispered, her voice a sharp, jagged edge disguised as maternal concern. She didn't address the stolen letter. She didn't address the 14 years of theft. She went straight for the throat of my character. "You're ruining Brooke's day. You've always been so selfish, so dramatic. Patricia has clearly had far too much to drink, and you're using her delusions to make yourself a martyr. Look at your sister. She's terrified. If you had an ounce of the education you claim to want, you'd apologize for this embarrassing disruption and sit down. This is why you belong in the dirt, Laura. You don't have the class for a room like this." In the past, those words would have been a tactical nuke to my self-esteem. Today, they were just noise, the desperate static of a dying radio. I looked at Brooke, who was staring at us with wide, hollow eyes, then back at the woman who had proclaimed my death sentence over a cup of Earl Grey tea. I didn't feel anger. I felt a clinical, detached disgust. "Ruining the day, Mom," I said. My voice was low, steady, and resonant, carrying the authority of a commanding officer giving a briefing. "We aren't talking about the wedding. We're talking about a crime." I reached down. My black satin clutch felt slick against my calloused palm. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to be as slow as a fuse burning toward a crate of TNT. My fingers found the cold, silver latch. Click. The sound was sharp and metallic, a mechanical punctuation mark that silenced the immediate area. Diane's eyes snapped toward my purse. I saw the first genuine flicker of fear in her gaze. It wasn't the fear of a guilty conscience. It was the fear of a woman who realized she had lost the lead in the play. I didn't rush. I pulled out the heavy, high-bond envelope. It felt solid, a physical weight that represented 6 months of secret labor and 14 years of denied truth. I didn't throw it. I didn't make a scene. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was looming over her, the smell of her Chanel No. 5 clashing with the metallic scent of the heavy paper in my hand. I placed the envelope on the white linen tablecloth, pressing it down with enough force to make the silver spoons rattle against the porcelain. I positioned it directly in front of her glass of Pinot Grigio, physically blocking her access to her liquid comfort. The bright, unyielding blue shield of the Columbia University logo glared up at her under the artificial brilliance of the crystal chandeliers. General Studies, the letterhead stated in elegant, uncompromising ink. Priority admissions for active duty officers. Diane's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. She stared at the blue ink as if it were a live grenade. Her chest began to heave, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked up at me, her eyes searching for a crack in my armor, a way to gaslight me one last time. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Some fake document you printed to get back at me? You think anyone believes you could get in now? You're 32 years old, Laura. You're a grunt." I leaned down, bracing my hands on the table, my face inches from hers. I locked my eyes onto hers, a tactical hold that refused to let her look away. "You were right about one thing, Diane," I said, my words falling like heavy stones into the silence. "I didn't get in when I was 18. I believed I was too limited because you stole the proof that I wasn't. You watched me scrub floors for $63 and then threw my future in the garbage because you were terrified I'd be something you could never be. You spent 14 years building a house of lies, telling everyone I was born for the dirt." I tapped the blue shield on the letter. "But 6 months ago, I stopped listening to your orders. I paid the application fees with my own military pay. I wrote the essays with my own hands. I didn't ask for your permission, and I certainly didn't need your protection." They looked at my record. They looked at the barracks I built and the men I led while you were busy telling the neighbors I was a drudge. And they didn't just say, "Yes." They asked me why I hadn't applied sooner. I stood up straight, my height and my uniform perfect posture making her look small, withered, and pathetic in her Ralph Lauren dress. "The sentence you gave me is over. I'm not the audience anymore. I'm the commanding officer of my own life. And you? You're just a spectator watching your own destruction." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't need a rebuttal. I turned my back on her and the head table, leaving the blue letter sitting there like a smoking gun. I walked toward the exit, my heels hitting the floor with a rhythmic military precision. The trap wasn't just set, it had been sprung. Diane was sitting in the middle of her own ruins, and for the first time in 14 years, I was the one walking toward the light. The color didn't just drain from Diane's face, it evaporated, leaving behind a gray, sickly mask of panic that no amount of expensive foundation could hide. She lunged for the letter, her French-tipped nails scratching against the heavy, high-bond paper as she snatched it from the tablecloth. She turned it over and over, her eyes darting across the embossed seal and the signature of the Dean of Admissions, searching desperately for a typo, a smudge, or any sign of a forgery. Her breath began to come in short, jagged gasps, a sharp contrast to the polished elegance she had projected only minutes ago. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wide and bloodshot, the pupils pinpricks of pure terror. You are trying to ruin your sister's wedding with this pathetic hoax?" she hissed, her voice rising into a frantic, ugly screech that cut through the silence of the ballroom like a saw blade. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a hollow, wet rattle. "Is this how you get attention now, Laura? By printing out fake documents from universities you could never attend in 100 years? Look at everyone looking at you. You are embarrassing yourself with this delusion." But the hoax argument didn't hold. The heavy paper of the Columbia envelope felt too real in her hands, and the silence of the room was too heavy to be ignored. Brooke, who had been standing frozen like a marble statue, stepped forward. The bride, the jewel of the family, reached out and snatched the letter from Diane's trembling fingers. I watched Brooke's eyes move across the lines. I watched her face shift from confusion to a cold, crystalline realization. This was the golden child, finally seeing the tarnish on her own crown. Brooke pulled her head back, looking at our mother as if she were seeing a complete stranger for the first time. She stepped away, the white silk of her $3,000 wedding dress catching on the jagged edge of a silver chair. But she didn't care. "Mom, what did you do to her?" Brooke's voice was small, but it carried to every corner of the room. "All my life, you told me I was the smart one. You made me believe I had to be perfect because Laura was limited. You told me her skin was too dark and her mind was too slow for anything but the dirt. Was it all a lie? Did you have to cheat just to make me look better?" Diane reached out, her hands clawing the air toward Brooke's shoulders. "Brooke, honey, don't listen to her. I did everything for you. I sacrificed for your apartment, for your career. She's just a jealous grunt trying to take away your moment." Brooke violently shoved her mother's hand away. She slapped Diane's hand back with a sharp, stinging sound that echoed off the heavy mahogany walls. "You didn't sacrifice for me, Mom. You used me as a weapon to destroy my sister. You turned me into a doll so you could feel superior to everyone else." Brooke took another step back, her eyes filled with a sudden, deep-seated disgust. "I don't want your apartment. I don't want your image. I don't even want you near me right now." Diane opened her mouth to wail, to launch into the performance of the wounded, misunderstood martyr that had served her for 3 decades. She took a deep breath, preparing to flood the room with crocodile tears. But the sound was silenced by 3 sharp, rhythmic cracks of wood against the hardwood floor. Grandma Martha had stood up. She was 82 years old, her frame thin and bird-like. But in that moment, she held the authority of a Supreme Court justice. She slammed her heavy oak cane down a 3rd time, the sound vibrating through the porcelain plates on the tables. Her eyes, usually clouded by age, were as sharp as blue glass as she fixed them on Diane. "Sit down, Diane," Martha said. Her voice was thin, but it had the weight of a heavy artillery shell. "Not another word. You have brought enough shame to this family name tonight. You have lied to your children, and you have spat upon the service of a United States officer. You are a disgrace to the mother who raised you and the daughters you bore. Sit down." Diane's knees seemed to buckle. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She collapsed into her velvet-upholstered chair like a marionette with its strings cut. Her Ralph Lauren dress, once a symbol of her suburban empire, now looked like a shroud. She sat in the middle of her own wreckage, her mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic gasp. I stood at my full height. I didn't feel the need to shout. I didn't feel the need to strike her. The rage that had fueled me for 14 years had turned into something else, a cold, clinical peace. I reached up and slowly buttoned the front of my jacket, a final professional gesture that signaled the end of the engagement. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the relatives who had whispered about my limited reach for a decade. None of them could meet my gaze. "I don't need an apology from you, Diane," I said. My voice was calm, the steady tone of a captain who had already secured the objective. "Because an apology requires a soul, and you sold yours a long time ago for a New Jersey zip code and a designer label. You no longer have the power to hurt me because you no longer exist to me. You are a civilian, and I am a stranger." I looked at Brooke, who was sitting on the floor, her white dress spread around her like a broken wing, her head in her hands. Then I looked back at the hollow shell of my mother. "As of this second, I am establishing total and permanent radio silence. Do not call. Do not send your fake holiday cards. Do not ask about my life at Columbia. You are dismissed." I turned my back on the head table. The swamp green tulle of my bridesmaid dress felt like a uniform of victory as I walked toward the exit. I could hear the whispers behind me, the sound of an empire being dismantled by gossip and truth. I reached the mahogany doors, ready to breathe the cool night air of New Jersey for the last time. But a hand caught my elbow. It was Aunt Patricia. She was trembling, the smell of gin and 14 years of regret rolling off her in waves. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate need to speak. She leaned in close, her breath hot against my ear, her voice a jagged whisper. "Laura," she said, her fingers digging into my arm. "Wait. You think the letter was the only thing she stole? You need to know the rest. You need to know why she hated your father so much, and why she saw his face every time she looked at you. There is more, Laura. There is so much more. The doors of the ballroom hung open, the light from the hallway spilling across the floor. I stood on the threshold, caught between the freedom of the exit and the dark gravity of a final secret. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase of intelligence. The hotel corridor was long, sterile, and smelled faintly of industrial lavender and old carpet. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow thud of my suitcase wheels hitting the seams between the floorboards. It was nearly midnight, and the air inside the building felt heavy, as if the weight of the earlier confrontation in the ballroom had leaked through the vents and settled here. I reached the elevator bank, my hand trembling slightly as I pressed the cold metal button. I wasn't running away anymore. I was withdrawing my forces from a territory that was no longer worth the cost of the occupation. Laura, wait, please, just stop for a second. I turned to see Aunt Patricia hurrying down the hallway, her breathing ragged and her eyes wild with a desperate kind of clarity. She looked older than she had an hour ago, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hotel ceiling highlighting every line of regret on her face. She reached me and grabbed my elbow, her fingers digging into the fabric of my coat. She didn't say anything at first. She just shoved a crumpled, yellowed envelope into my hand. I stole this from her desk 10 years ago, Patricia whispered, her voice a jagged rasp in the quiet hall. I couldn't bring myself to give it to you then. I was too afraid of her. I was too afraid of what she'd do to me. But after tonight, you need to see the original sin, Laura. You need to see why she tried to kill your spirit before you even had a chance to breathe. I took the envelope. The paper felt brittle, like dried skin. I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside and unfolded it. The letterhead was unmistakable. Columbia University, Office of Undergraduate Admissions. But the date was from 35 years ago, and the name at the top wasn't mine. It was addressed to Diane Jordan. I read the words slowly. We regret to inform you that we are unable to offer you admission to the class of 1991. In that moment, the final puzzle piece didn't just fall into place, it shattered the entire image I had of my mother. All the years of being told I was limited, all the times she laughed at my ambitions, all the effort she put into convincing me that I belonged in the dirt. It wasn't because she thought I was a failure, it was because she was one. Diane hadn't spent 14 years trying to protect me from disappointment. She had spent 14 years trying to ensure I never achieved the one thing she had failed to reach. My success was a mirror that reflected her own inadequacy back at her, and she couldn't stand the sight. The imposter syndrome that had haunted my every command at Fort Liberty. The voice in my head that whispered I was just a girl from a pizza shop playing soldier. It wasn't my voice. It was her envy. It was the generational trauma of a woman who had failed to reach her American dream and decided to burn down the dreams of her own child to stay warm. I looked at the yellowed rejection letter and felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The great commander, Diane Jordan. The woman who had ruled my life with an iron fist of gaslighting and designer labels was suddenly small. She wasn't a monster. She was a cliché. She was a bitter suburban housewife who had used her children as bandages for her own wounded ego. She had tried to drown me in her own self-loathing because she couldn't bear to see me swim. She saw his face in yours, Laura, Patricia said, her voice trembling. Your father was the one who encouraged her to apply. When she got that letter, she didn't just give up. She turned that rejection into a weapon. She decided that if she couldn't have the Ivy League, no one in this house would. And when you showed that you actually had the brains she lacked, she couldn't handle it. She hated you for being better than her. I looked at Patricia, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to ask for more. I didn't need any more intelligence reports. I had everything. I saw the ruins of my mother's pride, and I realized that I had already won the war years ago, simply by surviving. The elevator dinked, the doors sliding open with a soft, mechanical sigh. I looked at the yellowed paper one last time. I didn't save it. I didn't keep it as a trophy. I crumpled it into a tight, hard ball and tossed it into the heavy, brushed steel trash can next to the elevator doors. It hit the bottom with a dull thud, the sound of a 35-year-old ghost finally being laid to rest. I stepped into the elevator and turned to face the hallway. Patricia stood there, looking small and broken, a bystander to a tragedy she had helped maintain for too long. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't have any words left for that version of my life. As the doors began to close, the phone in my pocket began to vibrate with a frantic, aggressive intensity. I pulled it out. The screen was illuminated by the caller ID. Mom. The vibration was so strong I could feel it through the bones of my hand. She was probably calling to scream about the wedding, to accuse me of elder abuse, to try and pull me back into her orbit for one last round of psychological warfare. I looked at the screen for exactly 3 seconds. I didn't feel my heart rate increase. I didn't feel the old, familiar panic. I swiped my thumb across the screen, opened the contact details, and hit the button labeled Block. The vibration stopped instantly. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of a border being closed. It was the sound of a radio silence that would last for the rest of my life. I stepped out into the cold, crisp midnight air of the hotel parking lot. The New Jersey skyline was a jagged line of lights in the distance, but I wasn't looking toward the suburbs. I was looking toward the city, toward the Blue Shield, toward a life where the only orders I followed were my own. I got into my car, locked the doors with a sharp, final click, and drove toward the highway. The mission was accomplished. I was finally home. September in Upper Manhattan carries a specific crispness, a sharp departure from the humid, suffocating heat of a North Carolina summer or the stagnant air of a New Jersey country club. I stood at the intersection of Broadway and 116th Street, staring up at the wrought iron gates of Columbia University. For the first time in 14 years, I wasn't wearing a uniform. I had traded my tactical boots for a pair of worn leather loafers and my army jacket for a simple denim coat. The weight on my shoulders hadn't vanished. Life doesn't work that way. But it had shifted. It was no longer a rucksack full of someone else's expectations and lies. It was just me. I remembered the voice of the admissions counselor when I had walked into his office 3 weeks prior. He was an older man, a veteran himself, who looked at my service record not as a list of industrial chores, but as a portfolio of leadership. He had leaned back in his chair, tapped my file, and said, "Captain Jordan, we don't just want you here. You belong here. You've already done the hard work. Now it's time to do the dreaming." As I walked through the gates and onto the brick-paved campus, the sound of the city seemed to fade into a hum of intellectual energy. The smell of old paper and polished oak wafted from the open doors of Butler Library, mixing with the scent of dried leaves swirling across the quad. I felt a strange, quiet pride blooming in my chest. I wasn't an imposter. I wasn't a limited girl from a pizza shop. I was a student at one of the finest institutions in the world. And I had earned my seat with 14 years of grit that my mother couldn't even imagine. While I was finding my rhythm in the library stacks, the empire I had left behind in New Jersey was finishing its collapse. The intelligence reports, if you could call the frantic texts from Aunt Patricia, that were conclusive. The perfect family Diane Jordan had spent decades curating had disintegrated in the wake of the wedding disaster. Brooke, the golden child, had finally seen the rot beneath the foundation. She didn't go on the honeymoon Diane had financed. Instead, she had packed her bags, moved out of the luxury apartment, and changed her locks. She refused to take Diane's calls, finally realizing she'd been nothing more than a high-priced mannequin in our mother's theater of vanity. Grandma Martha had delivered the final blow. She had officially banned Diane from the Sunday dinners at the family estate, stating that she wouldn't have a thief of dreams sitting at her table. Diane was now living in her big, beautiful house in the suburbs, surrounded by the expensive furniture and designer labels she loved so much. But she was utterly alone. The isolation she had tried to impose on me for 14 years had finally become her own reality. She was the one sitting in the darkened corner now. I sat down at a heavy oak table in the library, the morning sun streaming through the arched windows and casting long golden rectangles across my notebook. I opened my laptop to check my syllabus, but a notification popped up in my inbox. It was from a burner email address. I knew the tone before I even clicked it. The subject line was blank. The body of the email was a masterpiece of narcissistic propaganda. Diane had written a long, rambling paragraph that looked like a legal brief for a victim who didn't exist. She used the word sacrifice 4 times in the first 3 sentences. She claimed she had only hidden the letter to save me from the pain of inevitable failure. She used the word ungrateful twice, accusing me of being the one who had shattered the family peace just to satisfy my own ego. I hope you're happy, the email concluded, knowing that you've destroyed everything I worked for just because you couldn't handle the truth about yourself. You always were the difficult one, Laura. I hope Columbia is worth the blood you've left on the floor. I stared at the screen. A year ago, this email would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. It would have made me feel like a criminal for wanting a life. But as I sat in the quiet dignity of that library, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel the need to reply. I looked at her words and saw them for exactly what they were. Trash. It was the desperate, pathetic static of a defeated enemy trying to fire one last shot from a broken weapon. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, the warmth of the paper cup grounding me in the present. I moved the cursor over the trash can icon. My finger didn't hesitate. I didn't save the email for evidence. I didn't forward it to Patricia. I just pressed delete. Click. The message vanished. The screen went back to my Greek philosophy syllabus. The digital ghost of Diane Jordan was gone. I looked out the window at the students walking across the lawn, their faces full of the kind of effortless ambition I had been denied for so long. For 14 years, I had stood on the front lines, protecting a country that didn't always see me. I had built structures that would stand for decades, and I had led men through the red dust of the South. I had been a soldier in every sense of the word. But as the leaves crunched under the feet of the people outside, I realized my greatest act of defense wasn't on a battlefield in North Carolina or in a tent in the desert. My greatest achievement was right here, in this quiet moment of absolute boundaries. I had finally learned how to protect the one person I had been taught to despise, myself. I picked up my pen, feeling the solid weight of it in my hand. The war was over. The occupation was finished. I had reclaimed the territory of my own future, and for the first time in 32 years, the only orders I was following were the ones I gave myself. It was 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in New York City, and the horizon had never looked so clear. It is never too late to take back the command of your own life.